Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at UCF. Our guest today is Ambassador Myles Frechette, former U.S. Ambassador to Colombia, former President of the Council of Americas, a veteran in many business and government environments, and a specialist on trade based in Washington. Welcome, Ambassador Frechette.
Good to see you, John.
Thank you for joining us today. Why don't you start by giving us just a broad overview of the business environment in the Americas today? Are you optimistic about the next 5 years, pessimistic, or somewhere in the middle?
No, I'm optimistic. We've had 5 years of growth. Countries have built up the reserves. Brazil and Argentina have paid off the International Monetary Fund. Brazil, Venezuela, and Chile are buying new weapons systems. And Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina and Chile are reducing poverty. So those countries are using their earnings in a way that can help the country overall. What the others do, of course, is crucial, and we're not tracking that too much. But I think, at least for the next 5 years, the outlook for commodities is to at least maintain the present levels or even go higher. So I think for the next 5 years, things are going to be in very good shape. The governments are going to have the capability to carry out a number of programs.
Within that environment, what are the prospects for free trade? We had discussions about free trade going back now more than a decade and a half, and the heyday back in the 90s, and now we seem to be moving in more of a bilateral direction.
Well, it's very interesting. On the Latin American side, of course, you have President Chavez, who rejects the free trade agreement. President Morales of Bolivia, who says, yes, but we want a special deal, and the same thing with Ecuador. But you remember in the last summit meeting in Mar del Plata in 2005, Brazil and Argentina sort of said, well, maybe, but not yet. And now the private sector in Brazil is saying, you know, we made a big mistake. We should have gone into a free trade agreement with the United States. Argentina is still agnostic on that, but I don't want to get too carried away. The big problem now is right here in the United States. The refusal of the Democrats to give a green light to the Colombia FTA and the Panama FTA, the talk by two of the candidates in the Democratic Party that they would want to at least look again at NAFTA, review it, and maybe, if needed, revise it. I don't think that's going to happen because I think they're going to find that the nexuses between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are already too deeply ingrained to go back on. But the uncertainty is now here. Very strange how in two and a plus years, the things have sort of have changed. What is the Brazilian private sector talking about? Well, they're thinking about the relationship on ethanol with the United States. They're thinking of creating more of a partnership. They have run into limitations in Brazil as a country. They want to invest in other countries. They want to do more trade. So now, you know, the private sector in Brazil, I'm not going to say is going to force the government. That's not going to happen in Brazil. Is talking a lot, and you can read it in newspapers and so on and so forth, sort of saying, that was a mistake in 2005. We should have moved forward. I think that if the next administration is in any way favorable to trade, that you could see the next administration in its 4 years try to work something out with Brazil. And I think if the attitude of the Brazilian private sector is as it is today, could be. Argentina, they have enormous problems. I mean, President Kirchner, the second President Kirchner, has got corruption, she's got crime, she's got to increase the energy prices, which is going to be hugely unpopular there. They're going to have tremendous shortages of gas and electricity. She and President Lula have been talking about this. And I think, you know, the Argentines feel that they have recovered from the crisis of 2001 in their own way, and they don't want to go back to the old way of doing things. So I'm optimistic.
You mentioned the debate between some of the Democratic candidates on the trade issue. I've had many people come to me and say, why is there so little discussion in this campaign about global topics in general? So this is probably a discussion that some people are eager to hear. Why is there, in your opinion, so little discussion about international topics in an era of globalization where everything that happens internationally affects us at home in our communities?
Well, there is a sense in the United States that we have lost manufacturing jobs, and it's true, but it's not because of the free trade agreements. It's technology changes. Take a look at pictures of auto plants building a car. All kinds of robots there, welding. That sort of stuff, not too long ago, was done by human beings. But that's a way of sort of venting your frustration. And there's another issue that really needs urgent attention, the Trade Assistance Act. Trade Assistance Act has never been really utilized to help American workers who have been basically put out of work because of free trade. It has to be beefed up. The Democrats have, in fact, presented a beefed up version of it, and the administration saying it goes too far. But you know, I think that everyone that I know that deals on trade issues is agreed that the Trade Adjustment Act has to be, or Trade Assistance Act has to be passed. And with that, then there will be less angst on the part of trade union members and others about free trade. But as long as we have this game, well, maybe I'll do it, maybe I don't, I think it puts the whole thing on hold, and it lends itself to exploitation by those people who insist no more free trade agreements, they're bad for the economy.
Do you think there should be more discussion about trade and other international topics in this presidential campaign?
And I'm very confident that whoever's elected president next year is going to understand the importance of trade to our objectives. And it fits in very well with the argument that this administration has not used enough diplomacy. There ought to be more diplomacy. Well, trade is a very important part of that. If you look at practitioners of diplomacy in Europe, trade goes hand in glove with that sort of stuff. They're natural partners. And so I think we're just going to have to wait until after the elections. I just can't believe that that tremendous synergy, which makes every bit of sense of the world, is going to be abandoned by the next president. Just can't believe it.
When you think back about the history of the free trade discussion, and you've been involved in this since the first ones leading up to NAFTA, was that the right approach at the wrong time? What went wrong with that initiative and the plans to establish a free trade area in the Americas?
Well, I think, you know, it was a tremendous thought, and it came out of the first Bush administration back in 1990. The job that I had was to get the countries of the region ready for free trade. We had this Enterprise for the Americas initiative in which USTR, and I was the head for Latin America, began to meet with all the countries of the hemisphere and to explain to them about free trade and how you began with little steps. You began to trade more between the countries of the region, then you went to other parts of the world until you finally felt confident enough to globalize. And you know, as a result of that, trade just within Latin America has tripled since the early 1990s, more than tripled. It was the right approach, but I think that in the process of the NAFTA, we ran into several issues, and I traveled around the country debating opponents of the NAFTA and talking up the value of NAFTA. But part of the issue was an issue that we're dealing with now on immigration. There was it was this sense that somehow we were getting too close to the Mexicans. It's a painful thing to say, but I truly believe that that was one of the problems that NAFTA had. The administration didn't work on that aspect of it enough. Very sad to say. The NAFTA was passed, but I don't think I'm far off. I mean, look at the reluctance that there has been, for example, to allow Mexican truckers to travel all around the United States. It should have happened a couple of years ago, if I remember correctly, and it still hasn't happened. Congress is just looking the other way. The other thing is that when you're trying to sell a free trade agreement, sometimes the advertisement is gets a little bit ahead of the reality. Both the Mexicans on their side with their own people and we in the United States, I remember very well all the talking points, talked about the increase in trade and this and that and the other, and we tended to minimize difficulties that were clearly going to emerge. And so then the NAFTA becomes reality, and people begin to see that many of the things that had been talked about in the debate, in fact, were not happening, and I think that just added fuel to the fire. I know that this sounds counterintuitive, but as we move on trade, I don't think we should ever try to oversell a trade agreement. This is going to make us grow enormously. No, these things do take time, but they do present a real net benefit. Take a look at the number of small American businesses that now exist because of NAFTA. I mean, there's 200,000 plus. They don't all do business with Mexico, but just the idea that you're opening up provides employment and business all over the United States. There isn't a single state in the Union that does not now, at the small and medium enterprise side, do business. I think we've allowed the debate to be captured by the naysayers, and I think that going forward, we have to talk about the realities. How much are you really going to increase trade? And here's the thing, you know, every bit of trade does in fact have a multiplier effect in our society. Let's talk for a moment about the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Colombia Free Trade Agreement has been in existence for 15 years. It would be a shame if they didn't get their free trade agreement. But what has happened? In that time, the Colombians, through the exportation of flowers to this country, have transformed the flower business in this country. You can now go into a supermarket and buy great flowers from Colombia and now from Ecuador too. And in the United States, thousands of jobs have been created right in this state, in the state of Florida. People don't think of that very much. You know, they think it's because Joe Smith's factory had to close. It must have been linked somehow to trade. They don't realize that other kinds of jobs are being created. We don't talk enough about that, and we ought to be more realistic.
As you look across the political landscape in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are some states where there's an interest in developing an economic relationship with the United States and exploring these bilateral free trade arrangements. And in other places, there's the so-called new populism, where there's a different approach. Is that something that you think is on the rise? And if so, will it over time be increasingly disruptive to the United States and like-minded countries, or is that just a passing phenomenon?
I think it's a passing phenomenon, but I don't think it's going to be repaired overnight. What we're talking about is Venezuela, we're talking about Bolivia, and we're talking about Ecuador. You know, Venezuela has always been a country that really lived off of one commodity. And so it's, at least in my experience, and I was stationed there in the late late 90s. I'm sorry, the late 70s. They had the sense that they had so much money coming in that the whole idea of opening up and dropping tariffs and so on and so forth really wasn't an issue that they were very concerned with. That they had the money to buy. And in my experience, when I was with the Enterprise for the Americas Initiative, I found that the Venezuelans were the least interested of the South American countries, or indeed of the whole region, in talking trade. Mexico, on the other hand, is very interested in free trade. It has been from the beginning, and it continues to be. And Mexico is going right ahead. You know, they have free trade agreements with the EU. They have free trade agreements, obviously, with us, but they're trying to open up with Asia. So and Bolivia and Ecuador are countries that you have leaders who sort of come out of areas other than the traditional political leadership in the region. Both Morales, who used to be a coca farmer and a trade union leader, and Mr. Correa, who was an economist educated in this country, are working with political systems in which, frankly, the Congress didn't work. In the case of Ecuador, because many of the political parties are in effect owned by political chieftains and they don't represent the will of the people. So these are people from outside the normal political grounds. And Mr. Chavez is also from outside. He has the view that the elites in Venezuela sold the country down the river through corruption, one thing and another. But you know, economics do not exist in one version in Venezuela, another version in Bolivia, another version in Ecuador. There are general rules of economics, and what makes me feel optimistic about Latin America is that most of the countries understand that there are some general rules of economics which, if they follow them, they can keep their inflation down, they can keep fiscally responsible policies, and they can create jobs for their people. They may not agree with everything we do, but they agree on that. And I think that with the passage of time, their success is going to show people in the three countries I've mentioned, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, who are going to say, you know, maybe that was a mistake. Maybe we should be looking at what some of our neighbors are doing and going forward. I do think this, that even though Bolivia and Ecuador are not going to get a free trade agreement because they were unwilling to negotiate, the Congress seems willing to extend the Andean trade preference. And that's very wise. And that's why I believe that, you know, when the new president and Congress are in office, they're going to change somewhat their views on trade. The people in Congress who deal with this, the Ways and Means Committee, the Finance Committee, and the Senate, understand perfectly well that if you take away these special benefits, hundreds of thousands of people in Bolivia and Ecuador are going to lose their jobs. People in the shrimping industry, people in petroleum, and so on and so forth. And I just think that it's a totally unnecessary harm to those two countries. You know, we've been allowing their stuff duty-free for years, 15 years now. Frankly, there is no additional cost to the United States to continue that, and we continue to build a reservoir of goodwill down there by, frankly, contributing directly to hundreds of thousands of jobs. We can also go to those countries and say, you know, we know you don't agree with us on fighting drugs in exactly the same way, but let's cooperate in the ways that we can. So, you know, I tend to believe that those countries which right now are led by leaders who are kind of outside the system, who are saying, we're not going to submit to the way, you know, the Americans or the Europeans say, we're going to do it our own way, are going to learn over time that their own way is not going to help their own people. It's not going to create really important employment or anything like that.
Let's go back to Venezuela for a moment. You were talking about different pathways to economic development. Obviously, that is not one that's selecting the mainstream that some of the other countries have opted for. How can Venezuela deliver the kind of economic development that Chavez seems to imply in his speeches if it continues on this course?
It can't.
And when will that be realized by the majority that this isn't happening?
I tend to think that people in Venezuela already can see that the policies pushed forward by President Chavez don't work. If you're, you know, ostensibly he's out to raise, get more people out of poverty. He's trying to help the working class, and yet you go to the stores, there are no eggs, there's no flour. Why is that? Because they've put caps on the prices of these items, and you know, rules of economics being that you can't buy something and then sell it for less than you bought it for and stay in business. His answer has been to more capping, more government intervention, and we know from, you know, decades with the communist system in the Soviet Union, the command system simply doesn't work. You know, the more Chavez tries to tinker and put all of this, take it out of sort of normal economics and put it under government control, the less it works. So the first thing they have to do, it seems to me, and it would be a boon to everybody, would be to put the PDVSA, stop its being a milk cow for the government's foreign relations, but instead make it run professionally. It is not being run professionally today. Everybody says so, despite what the government argues. They are not producing even the petroleum they tell their own people in the world that they are. They could be doing everybody a favor by producing more. After all, the price of petroleum is not necessarily going down. They'll make more money. But because of the way he's trying to run PDVSA, run it as a milk cow, they're not going to get that kind of cooperation. And there are all kinds of other externalities. For instance, it's very hard to get drilling rigs in the world today. So Venezuela can't even get all the drilling rigs it needs to do the exploration that would allow them to improve the pumping of oil. Now, I think that that's the first thing. Get PDVSA back on a proper business footing. And then the other thing is, quite frankly, is to start pulling back from some of the controls the government is trying to use to keep prices artificially low. That'll take years.
Mm-hmm. Let's take the Venezuela issue and move it in a slightly different direction toward Cuba. This is a relationship that has been growing ever since Chavez assumed power. And what do you think is the immediate future for this relationship? And what does the recent leadership change in Cuba mean for how it develops?
You know, the reality is Venezuela gives Cuba $1 billion a year of petroleum. In exchange, the Cubans provide doctors and teachers and technical assistance of one kind and another. I don't think that Chavez and Fidel, despite Chavez's obvious adoration of Fidel, I don't think Fidel really ever thought that Chavez is going to be somebody with whom they can work closely together. After all, Chavez's kind of volcanic temper gets him into trouble every once in a while with some of the neighbors, and Fidel has to bail him out. Now Fidel is basically in the background. You've got Raul. Raul is he's a very tough guy. Remember, he was Fidel's assassin. You know, when Fidel wanted people killed within the movement, his brother did it personally. But he's very organized. He likes to make the trains run on time. He likes to have the economy work better. And I don't think that some of the things that Chavez does are really going to enchant Raul either. Bottom line, I think there's going to be a period of some adjustment in the Venezuela-Cuba relationship. Exactly where it's going to, they're not obviously going to cut Chavez off. They need the $1 billion. But, you know, Cuba itself may discover some oil offshore. It may become less dependent. I think we're in for a period in which the relationship is going to change. I think the Cubans may, in fact, be looking for other friends in the region. I mentioned earlier the meetings between President Lula and Fidel Castro. That is no coincidence. That's not, you know, this is not President Lula just going to look at the beaches at Varadero. No, he's there for a very real purpose. One, you know, he's there to see the icon of the left in Latin America. It's very important, and Fidel may not live long. But secondly, he is, by being received by Fidel, they're sending out a signal. Fidel, Chavez, or Chavez, Raul are not the only game in town as far as the left is concerned. Because if you look at the left in Latin America, you know, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, these are all countries that, you know, they're not the same as the United States, but they certainly understand that through market opening, you can improve the situation for your citizens, provide jobs, provide greater prosperity. And, you know, it doesn't matter what Chavez says, they're going to continue thinking along those lines. Brazil is not going to be deviated from its course because President Chavez says so or makes good speeches about it.
In light of all this, we're in the midst of a presidential campaign in the United States, and there will be a new president next year. What advice would you offer to the person who wins that office, specifically in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean? What are maybe 3 specific recommendations that you would make that could improve the relationship the United States has with the region?
I think the first one is to state clearly and unequivocally, as long as you're democratic, we want to work with you. Number 2, if you have some reform programs that you have thought up that are going to help you become more competitive in the world, we'll help you with that. You can do that with capacity building. The number of things you can do to help in competitiveness is just almost infinite. It goes from building ports and railroads to providing better education. If you look at education in Latin America today, it's lamentable. It's lamentable. By any measure, the education that Latin Americans get is not enough to make them competitive in today's world. So education, as I've said earlier, the whole business of building ports and railroads, regulation, for example, sanctity of contracts. There's just a million things, literally, that can be done that will improve the competitiveness of the countries of the region, and we should stand ready to give them help. And third, I think there are some very urgent issues related to the spread of the collateral damage of the drug trade that are hurting particularly the Caribbean basin, particularly the small, poor countries in Central America and in the Caribbean. These are countries that are just being ground to death by transnational crime, not just the gangs that are down there, but the corruption of the drug money that's going on its way to the United States. We have to help those countries work better together. One of the things that we have to do is to give them capacity building, because the police systems in some of these very small places are simply not up to it. Not only that, but in many of these smaller countries, it's the education of the senior police officials is sometimes grade school. And you're talking about a very sophisticated enemy, the narco-traffickers. If you're going to get cooperation at a high level, you have to have police that understand the way the world works and are prepared to share information and act on it in prompt measures. So I would say those three things.
I think we will conclude. I'd like to thank you, Ambassador Frechette, for joining us today.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.